Wyoming Territory. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the empty plains, tearing at the battered wooden fences that barely stood against the force of the storm. The land was vast, raw, and merciless, stretching as far as the eye could see, an endless sea of snow-dusted earth under a leaden sky. A lone rider advanced slowly, his figure half swallowed by the swirling gusts. Samuel Granger, 50 years old, sat hunched in the saddle of a weary bay mare, his broad shoulders stooped, his face lined with the etchings of time and sorrow. His wide-brimmed hat did little to shield him from the cold, and his oilskin coat flapped wildly as he urged the horse forward. Each step of the mare's hooves crunched in the frozen ground, breaking the heavy silence of the land. Samuel's eyes, pale blue and sharp despite their fatigue, scanned the horizon. There was nothing but the biting wind, the dark shapes of distant pines, and the weight of his own thoughts. The ache in his bones wasn't from the cold alone. It was the ache of 5 years of loneliness, years spent talking to shadows in his empty house, to the ghost of a woman he once loved, to the memory of a child who never made it past his 5th birthday. Cholera had stolen them both, and since then, Samuel had known no peace. The ranch came into view as the storm thickened, a patchwork of broken fencing, sagging rooflines, and empty corrals. Once this had been a place of promise, where he and his wife, Annie, had dreamed of building a legacy. Now it was little more than a graveyard of hopes. Samuel dismounted, his legs stiff, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice as he led the mare into the lean-to. The wind slammed the door behind him as he entered the house, a dim and silent shelter that smelled of smoke and old wood. He stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the empty hearth, the worn chair by the fire, the cracked photograph on the mantel. He imagined Annie's voice, soft, warm, filled with life. But it was only the wind. The next morning dawned gray and bitter. Samuel woke to the sound of knocking, sharp, insistent. He opened the door to find Josiah Wilkes, an old trapper with a face like leather and eyes like flint. Josiah stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, stomping snow from his boot. "Bad business down at the Miller homestead," Josiah said, pulling off his gloves. "Widow Miller's near starvin'. Got a daughter, young thing, pregnant. She's tryin' to trade the girl off for supplies." Samuel froze. "You're sayin' she's sellin' her own kin?" Josiah nodded grimly. "World's gone hard, Sam. Folks'll do worse before this winter's done. Figured you'd want to know. Ain't right, but maybe you could. I dunno, help the girl. She's in a bad way." Samuel's first instinct was revulsion. The idea of buying a woman, like she was a cow or a mule, sickened him. But as the day wore on, the thought wouldn't leave him. What choice did the girl have, with a mother willing to barter her for a sack of flour? What would happen to her in the hands of a crueler man? That night, he sat by the fire, staring at the flames until they blurred. When morning came, he saddled the mare, packed what little he could spare, some beans, a sack of cornmeal, a battered rifle, and rode out. The Miller homestead was worse than he'd imagined. The house leaned as if ready to fall, the roof patched with hides and old cloth. Smoke barely rose from the chimney. He found Widow Miller standing on the porch, wrapped in a tattered shawl, her eyes hard as flint, her lips pressed into a line. Maria stood behind her, thin arms folded over her swollen belly, her face pale beneath a mop of dark hair. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her eyes stayed on the ground, and when the wind lifted her hair, Samuel saw the faint bruise on her cheek. "Come for the girl?" Widow Miller's voice was sharp, bitter. "I ain't got time for pleasantries. We need food, and we need it now." Samuel dismounted, heart heavy. "This ain't right. She's your daughter. And what's right got to do with survival?" The widow spat on the ground. "You want her or not? Ain't like you'll find better company out here." Maria flinched at her mother's words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't look at Samuel, but her hands trembled at her sides. Samuel looked at the supplies he'd brought. He hadn't planned on actually doing this, but the storm clouds were gathering again, dark and angry, and he couldn't leave the girl here. He reached for the sack of cornmeal, the beans, the rifle. He threw in the old mule tied behind his horse. Too much. More than he could afford. But he couldn't walk away. Widow Miller snatched the goods without another word, hauling them inside. The door slammed shut, leaving Maria standing alone on the porch. For a moment she didn't move, as if she couldn't believe she was free, or maybe because she wasn't sure freedom was what waited for her. "Come on," Samuel said gently, offering his hand. Maria hesitated, then stepped down, her boots crunching in the snow. She took his hand, her fingers ice-cold, and let him help her onto the horse. He swung up behind her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She didn't speak as they rode away, the house shrinking behind them until it disappeared into the falling snow. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the wind and the steady plod of the horse. Samuel could feel her shivering against him, could hear the soft hitch of her breath when she tried not to cry. The weight of what he'd done, what they both had been forced into, settled heavy on him. "You'll be safe now," he said at last, his voice rough with emotion. Maria didn't answer, but as the first stars appeared in the deepening dusk, she turned her face slightly, just enough for him to hear her whisper, "Thank you." And then she was silent again, the words swallowed by the endless plains, by the wind that carried both sorrow and the faintest promise of something more. The morning sun crept slowly over the jagged line of the distant mountains, casting long, pale fingers of light across the frost-covered ground. Samuel stood on the porch of his ranch house, his breath rising in soft plumes. The land, wild and unyielding, stretched before him, silent and watching. Inside, he heard the faint rustle of movement, the cautious steps of Maria as she began another day in this unfamiliar place. Their first nights together under the same roof had been marked by quiet unease. Samuel kept to his chair by the fire, while Maria stayed behind the door of the small guest room that once belonged to his son. She moved softly, almost like she feared to disturb the air. When she passed him, she kept her head down, hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. He respected her space, spoke little, and offered what kindness he could, an extra blanket folded at the foot of her bed, the better portion of whatever simple meal he managed to prepare. Snow still blanketed the ground, though patches of brown earth peeked through where the sun hit hardest. Samuel set about his morning chores, the rhythm of ranch life offering him a small measure of peace. He chopped wood, repaired the chicken coop where the wind had split a board, checked the fences that leaned tiredly against the weight of winter. Maria, to his surprise, began to help. At first, she simply watched, standing at a distance, but soon enough, she took to carrying small loads of firewood, gathering eggs, and even patching a tear in his coat with quiet determination. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Samuel spotted tracks near the outer edge of his land, tracks too large for coyote and too purposeful for wandering game. He knelt, fingers brushing the impressions in the snow, heart quickening. Boot. And another set, softer, narrower. A hunter, maybe. Or something worse. The next day, unease grew in him like a splinter under the skin. As he repaired a broken fence post, Maria approached, her face pale against the dark wool of the shawl she clutched tightly around her shoulders. "I heard something last night," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "Outside. A sound like voices." Samuel straightened, scanning the line of trees that marked his property. The wind whispered through the branches, but nothing stirred. "You stay close to the house," he told her. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." That night the air grew heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. Samuel sat by the fire, rifle across his knees, ears straining for any sign of danger. Maria slept fitfully in the room beyond, her faint murmurs reaching him through the thin walls. He thought of his wife, of the soft songs she used to hum when storms gathered, of the warmth that once filled this house. A wave of loneliness washed over him so strong it nearly choked him. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound, the soft crack of a twig beneath a boot. Samuel rose silently, moving to the window. The moon hung low and full, casting a silver sheen over the yard. There, at the tree line, a figure stood. Tall, lean, motionless. The man's long dark hair moved slightly in the breeze, and even at a distance, Samuel saw the gleam of the scar that ran down his cheek. The stranger did not approach, did not lift a weapon or shout a challenge. He merely watched, as though weighing Samuel's worth. The next morning, Samuel found more signs. A feather left on the porch rail, fresh tracks leading toward the river, but no sign of threat. The presence of this silent watcher both unnerved and intrigued him. Days turned into weeks. The winter softened its grip little by little, and with it, Samuel and Maria fell into a routine. They worked together without speaking much, but the silences became less strained. He showed her how to mend the fences, how to gather the eggs without spooking the hens. She showed him small kindnesses in return. A loaf of bread made from what little flour they had left, herbs she found near the creek that eased the ache in his back. One afternoon, a scream shattered the quiet. Samuel dropped the bucket he was carrying and ran toward the sound, his heart pounding. He found Maria at the edge of the corral, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed toward the tree line. A mountain lion, sleek and hungry, crouched low in the brush, its eyes locked on a calf that had strayed too far. Samuel grabbed his rifle and fired a warning shot. The cat flinched but held its ground. Another step, muscles rippling beneath its tawny coat. Samuel fired again, this time grazing the animal's flank. The mountain lion snarled and leapt into the undergrowth, vanishing as swiftly as it had appeared. When he turned back, Maria was on her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to calm the frightened calf. Without thinking, Samuel knelt beside her, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. She flinched at first, but then, slowly, she relaxed under his touch. "That was brave," he said softly. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I thought it would kill us both." "You did good," Samuel replied. And for the first time, he saw her not as the frightened girl he had taken in, but as a woman of quiet strength, tempered by hardship. That night, he found fresh signs of the watcher. The traps he'd set for small game had been reset with greater skill than his own. A pile of neatly stacked firewood waited by the door, and near the coals of the dying fire pit, a small token carved from bone, a hawk in flight. Samuel stood in the yard for a long time, staring into the shadows, knowing he was not alone in this struggle. Days later, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, Samuel finally met the stranger face to face. He was tending the fence near the western edge when the man emerged from the trees. His presence was quiet, as if he stepped out of the very earth itself. "I am Grey Hawk," the man said, his voice low but steady. "Your land borders mine. I have watched." Samuel nodded, heart still racing from the surprise. "You've helped us." Grey Hawk inclined his head. "Danger comes. Bandits. Desperate men. They'll come for what you have." Samuel felt a chill despite the warmth of the sun. "Then I thank you for the warning. And your help." Grey Hawk said nothing more, only glanced toward the house where Maria stood in the doorway, watching. Then, without another word, he turned and melted back into the trees. As darkness fell, Samuel sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, the carved hawk talisman heavy in his hand. Maria joined him, the silence between them now companionable rather than strained. "Who was he?" she asked at last. "An ally, I hope," Samuel said. "One we didn't know we needed." And as the stars pricked the velvet sky, Samuel felt, for the first time in many years, that perhaps they weren't as alone as he'd thought. The night was still dangerous, the future uncertain. But now there was a thread of hope woven through the darkness, fragile, yes, but strong enough to hold. The days that followed Grey Hawk's warning carried an unease that settled deep into Samuel's bones. The air itself felt different, heavier, as if the land anticipated the storm to come. Maria sensed it too. She moved with greater care, keeping the doors bolted and the rifle within arm's reach even when she worked at the stove. The ranch, once a place of routine and quiet, now seemed like a fortress under siege by invisible forces. The bond between Samuel and Maria grew in those tense days, forged in the small, silent moments of shared labor and worry. Where once they had worked side by side in awkward quiet, now they moved as a pair, their efforts synchronized without the need for word. Samuel taught her how to load and fire the rifle. He showed her where to aim, how to brace herself against the recoil. Maria's hands trembled the first time she squeezed the trigger, the shot echoing across the valley. But with each lesson, the fear in her eyes gave way to determination. Late one afternoon, Samuel spotted the first clear sign of the threat Greyhawk had spoken of. On a ridge just beyond his western pasture, 3 riders paused, their dark figures silhouetted against the reddening sky. Too far to make out faces, but their posture spoke of arrogance. The way they surveyed his land, like men who already considered it theirs. Samuel watched, heart pounding, until they turned and disappeared over the rise. That night, the ranch felt smaller, as if the walls had drawn in close. Maria sat at the table, mending one of Samuel's shirts by the flickering lantern light. He cleaned his rifle in silence, every click of metal against metal loud in the stillness. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters and stirring the dry grass like the whisper of approaching danger. "You think they'll come soon?" Maria asked, her voice low. Samuel nodded, his jaw tight. "They're watching, waiting for the right moment." Maria swallowed hard, fingers knotting the thread she held. "What do we do?" "We stand our ground," Samuel said. His voice was steady, but inside doubt gnawed at him. He was one man against whatever evil rode those horses. But he couldn't show her that fear. Not now. The following days became a blur of preparation. Samuel reinforced the doors and windows, dug shallow trenches around the barn, and moved the livestock closer to the house. Maria gathered food and water, storing it where it could be reached quickly if they were forced to hole up inside. Every task they completed brought them closer together, their shared purpose weaving a fragile sense of unity. And then, without warning, the storm broke. It was just past midnight when the first shot rang out, shattering the fragile peace of the night. Samuel jolted awake, heart racing, and grabbed his rifle. Maria was already out of bed, wrapping herself in a blanket, her eyes wide with terror but her hands steady. They crept to the window. By the light of the moon, Samuel saw them, 4 men now, creeping toward the house. One carried a torch, the flickering flame casting monstrous shadows across the yard. Another fired a shot into the air, a cruel taunt meant to terrify. Samuel took aim, breath slow, finger steady on the trigger. His shot cracked the night open, and one of the intruders fell hard into the dirt. The others scattered, shouting curses into the dark. But they did not retreat. Hours stretched as the attackers circled the house, testing its defenses, trying to draw Samuel out. Samuel fired when he had a clear shot, conserving his ammunition, every bullet precious. Maria stayed low, reloading for him, her face pale but set with resolve. The child inside her kicked and shifted, as if sensing its mother's fear. As dawn approached, the attackers fell back, disappearing into the woods. But Samuel knew it wasn't over. They would return, and next time, they'd come harder. Greyhawk appeared as the first light touched the land, silent as always. His keen eyes took in the damage, the bullet-scarred walls, the trampled earth, the broken fence where a horse had spooked and bolted. "You fought well," Greyhawk said quietly. "But they will not stop." Samuel nodded, exhausted beyond words. "Then help us stop them." Greyhawk studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. Together, they set about fortifying the ranch further. Greyhawk showed Samuel how to set traps, how to use the land itself as a weapon. They dug hidden pits, strung lines that would trip a man in the dark, positioned sharp stakes where the enemy might charge. Maria, too, worked alongside them, her fear now tempered into something fierce and unyielding. In the quiet hours between their labors, Samuel and Greyhawk began to speak, not of strategy or survival, but of loss, of loneliness, of the weight a man carries when he lives long enough to see his dreams wither. Grey Hawk spoke of a family taken by disease, of a village lost to greed and violence. Samuel spoke of his wife, of the boy who had once filled this ranch with laughter. Maria listened, sometimes offering her own story, a husband dead of fever, a mother so broken by poverty she sold her only daughter to survive. The three of them, so different in origin, found common ground in the wounds they bore. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire, Grey Hawk taught Samuel how to read the signs of the land, the broken twig that marked a passing, the disturbed earth that meant someone had camped nearby. Samuel listened, eager to learn, humbled by all he did not know. Maria watched them from the porch, a soft smile on her lips for the first time in what felt like forever. As the days passed, small victories stitched hope back into the fabric of their lives. A trap caught one of the bandits who tried to scout too close. Another fled after falling into a pit, his screams echoing through the night until they were swallowed by the distance. But Samuel knew the final confrontation was coming. The men who hunted them were growing angrier, more desperate. And desperate men were the most dangerous kind. Through it all, the bond between Samuel, Maria, and Grey Hawk deepened. Samuel no longer felt the crushing weight of isolation. Where once he had borne his burdens alone, now he shared them, and in that sharing found unexpected strength. Maria no longer looked at him with fear or distance. Instead, she met his gaze with trust, with gratitude, perhaps even with the first stirrings of something gentler, something warmer. On the eve of what Samuel sensed would be the final attack, they gathered on the porch, the land before them bathed in silver moonlight. The silence was deep, but not empty. It hummed with the promise of what was to come, with the knowledge that together, they had become more than the sum of their scars. And when the night wind carried the distant sound of hooves once more, Samuel rose, rifle in hand, no longer a man alone against the dark, but a man ready, at last, to face whatever came. The night air felt thick with tension, every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. The hooves grew louder, pounding the earth like distant thunder, a grim herald of what was to come. Samuel, standing on the porch with rifle in hand, breathed slowly, trying to steady his racing heart. The scent of gunpowder from past skirmishes still lingered on the breeze, mixing with the faint sweetness of wildflowers crushed under boots. Maria stood behind him, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, the other gripping the handle of a pistol that seemed too large for her delicate fingers. Grey Hawk crouched at the edge of the porch, silent as stone, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The attackers emerged from the tree line, 6 men this time, hard-eyed and hungry for blood. Their leader, a scar-faced brute draped in a filthy coat, raised a hand, signaling the charge. They came fast, wild yells tearing through the night, guns raised, boots thundering across the ground. Samuel fired first, his shot striking true and dropping the lead rider before he could close the gap. Grey Hawk loosed an arrow that buried itself deep in another man's chest, sending him tumbling from his horse with a strangled cry. But the others pressed on, their fury unchecked. One reached the porch steps, swinging a rusted machete. Samuel met him with the butt of his rifle, the crack of bone loud in the chaos. The man fell back, clutching his shattered face, only to be trampled by his own comrades. The battle raged, brutal and raw. The air filled with the roar of gunfire, the thud of fists, the screams of the wounded. Maria, from her place behind the doorframe, fired when she could, her face pale but determined. Each shot was deliberate, aimed to protect the man who had risked everything for her. The child within her seemed to stir with the violence, as if sensing its mother's desperation. Grey Hawk moved through the fray like a ghost, his knife flashing, his bow bending and releasing with deadly precision. He fought not with anger, but with purpose, each movement efficient, controlled. Samuel, for his part, battled with the strength of a man who knew this was his last stand. Every muscle burned, every breath tore at his lungs, but he did not falter. One by one, the attackers fell, their ambition broken against the resolve of those who defended this patch of earth. When the final shot echoed into the night, and the last of the raiders lay still in the dust, a heavy silence followed, a silence filled with the weight of survival, of loss narrowly avoided. Samuel stood amid the wreckage, chest heaving, sweat mingling with blood on his brow. He turned to Maria, who dropped the pistol with trembling fingers and rushed into his arms. He held her close, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his own, the swell of her belly pressing between them, a reminder of the fragile life they fought to protect. Grey Hawk watched them, a quiet satisfaction in his gaze, though his expression remained grave. "It is over," he said softly. "For now." Together they buried the dead far from the house, marking the graves with simple stones. There was no joy in their victory, only relief and exhaustion. That night they sat together beneath the stars, too weary for words, bound by what they had endured. Days passed, and with the threat gone, a peace settled over the ranch. The land, once scarred by violence, began to heal, as did those who lived upon it. Samuel and Maria worked side by side, mending fences, tending livestock, rebuilding what had been damaged. Their bond deepened, no longer just forged in shared struggle but in quiet moments of tenderness. A glance across the fields, a hand brushed against another's in passing, a soft smile at day's end, these became the threads that wove them together. Maria's child grew restless in the womb, and soon the time came. The storm that rolled in the night she went into labor seemed a fitting reflection of the tempest within their small home. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the windows, and within those walls, life fought its way into the world. Samuel did not leave her side. His hands, so accustomed to toil and battle, now trembled as he offered what comfort he could. Grey Hawk, with knowledge passed down from his ancestors, guided them both, his calm presence a balm to their fear. The hours stretched long, the storm outside matching the intensity of the struggle within. But at last, with a final cry that was equal parts triumph and exhaustion, Maria brought forth a child, a boy, red-faced and strong-lunged, his wails cutting through the storm like sunlight breaking through clouds. Samuel stared at the child in wonder, tears streaking his weathered face. A miracle, he thought. After all he had lost, all he had endured, here was life renewed. Maria, pale and spent, smiled as she cradled her son, her eyes meeting Samuel's with a depth of feeling that needed no words. They named him Jacob, after Samuel's own father, a man who had taught him strength and kindness in equal measure. In the weeks that followed, the ranch transformed. Where once it had been a place of solitude and sorrow, it became a home filled with laughter, with the sweet music of a child's cries and coos, with the soft murmur of voices sharing plans and dreams. Grey Hawk remained, helping where he could, teaching young Jacob the ways of the land even as the boy lay swaddled in his mother's arms. Yet even in joy, Samuel knew peace was a fragile thing. The world beyond their valley still held dangers, and he would not forget the price they had paid for what they now cherished. But for now they had earned this peace, and he would savor it while it lasted. As summer deepened, Grey Hawk prepared to leave, his task here complete. On the morning of his departure, Samuel clasped his hand, gratitude too great for words. Maria embraced him, tears bright in her eyes. Grey Hawk said nothing, only nodded, then vanished into the wilderness as silently as he had come. Samuel stood watching the horizon long after the figure of his friend had faded. He knew their paths might never cross again, but Grey Hawk's presence would forever be a part of the story this land held, the story of how a lonely rancher, a young widow, and a wandering warrior had found, in each other, the strength to defy fate. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in gold, Samuel sat on the porch with Maria at his side and Jacob in his arms. The boy gripped his finger tightly, his eyes wide and curious. Samuel gazed out over the land he had fought for, the land that had nearly taken everything from him, and felt a bittersweet ache in his chest. He had found his miracle, yes, but he understood now that miracles were not grand moments of magic. They were built, piece by piece, in every choice to stand, to love, to hope. The cost of those choices lingered, shadows that would always be a part of him. But as he kissed the top of his son's head, as Maria leaned against him with a soft sigh, he knew it had all been worth it. And when the night wind rose once more, it carried no threat, only the promise of another dawn.